Hallo Leute, ik ben Lily en dit is Deutsch Für Euch.
So in this extra I'm going to talk about how to use multiple modal verbs in the same phrase. Since I'm uploading this together with an episode on the passive, my example sentences will be in the passive voice. However, these rules also apply to active sentences the same. Also, for the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about Hauptsätze today, but with the rules you know from my other videos about syntax, you should be able to easily put together how this then translates into Nebensätze. If you want, you could try it out in the comments and see if you got it right. Okay, let's get started. Let's try it on my apple example I've been using in the passive episodes. How about, it should be possible for the apple to be eaten. Der Apfel soll gegessen werden können. Literally, this would translate into, the apple should eaten be can. Of course, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever in English, but just so you can see how things are arranged. Or another example, it has to be possible for the apple to be eaten. Der Apfel muss gegessen werden können. The apple must eaten be can. Or to take it a step further, it has to be possible for the apple to want to be eaten. Der Apfel muss gegessen werden wollen können. The apple must eaten be want to can. Well, that's nice and all, but how do I deconstruct this? How do I know where to put which verb? Basically, this all depends on what you're trying to say, i.e., which modal verb is going to be the core of the meaning of your sentence. Again, this is also true for complex verb constructions outside of the passive. I'm just going to demonstrate it using the passive. So, in our sentence, der Apfel muss gegessen werden wollen können, so it has to be possible for the apple to want to be eaten. Our focus is on what must be possible. So, müssen, have to, or must is our head verb, meaning it gets conjugated and put in the left verb position. If we wanted to emphasize something else, for example, that something can be possible, we would put the können as our head verb in the conjugated position. Meaning, we would end up with a sentence, for example, der Apfel kann gegessen werden wollen müssen. So, it can be necessary for the apple to want to be eaten. Ignore the logic in this, it's all just so I can show you the constructions. So, what about the order of the verbs that are not conjugated? Again, this only depends on the contextual relationship they have with each other. So let's imagine this pile of modal verbs like a matryoshka or a stack doll. The outermost layer is our conjugated verb, so the verb that is in the left verb position in Hauptsatz, and that in our example was müssen. So this verb affects all the verbs that follow and tells us more about them. This leads us to the question, what does the apple have to do? The next verb is the modal verb at the very end of the Hauptsatz, so the last verb in the cluster of verbs packed at the end. In our example, that was können. What this does is, it tells us more about the other remaining verbs that I'm going to get to in a second, but it is itself affected by the conjugated verb. So we now get the new question, what does the apple have to be able to do? And then the last layer for our example is the verb wollen. This is the core. This is the detail that we're trying to get to, and this is the verb that defines what the sentence is actually trying to tell us. So that means it doesn't really affect any other verbs anymore, but it affects the entire sentence insofar that this is the actual meaning, and the other verbs are more or less just modifying this core verb. Which leads us to our final question, the one that would ask for the sentence that I used as an example, which would be, what does the apple have to be able to want to do? Meaning that if we have multiple verbs, the verb that we are trying to get to, the verb that is the detail, the core of our meaning, is the one that starts off the cluster. And then it is followed by every other verb, with every verb affecting the one preceding it, and the conjugated verb ends that entire cluster. In the Nebensatz, that's a bit clearer because in the Nebensatz, the conjugated verb, as you will remember, stands at the very end. So there we really have the perfect reverse order. We started with the conjugated at the end. That affects the one before it, that affects the one before it, and so on and so forth. In the Hauptsatz, we kind of have to rethink this because the cluster still works that way. We have core, and but the conjugated verb that affects all of them together stands before it. For those of you not satisfied with a 3-verb example because you're kind of panicking and you're thinking, well, but what if it happens to be 4 verbs? Let's look at that. The scenario would still be the same because the core meaning would still start off the cluster. Der Apfel muss gegessen werden, wollen, können, dürfen. The apple has to be allowed, to be able, to want, to be eaten. Der Apfel muss gegessen werden, wollen, können, dürfen. This is bullshit, so please don't freak out, but in theory, this is how it would work with your core starting off the cluster and the conjugated verb before that, or in a Nebensatz at the very end of the cluster. So in a Hauptsatz, we have the conjugated verb starting off, then we get the meaning verb and werden in between, and then we have the reverse order of importance with all the other ones leading up to the core that starts with the cluster. Again, in a Nebensatz, this would be even easier because there we would actually have core, second most, third most, conjugated verb. There it would really be 4, 3, 2, 1. Here it's 1, 4, 3, 2. And it would keep stacking that way. So to take it completely ad absurdum, if in a magical universe we had 5 modal verbs in the same sentence, we would still have the same order in the Hauptsatz, meaning we would go 1, 5, 4, 3, 2. I'm not going to even put up an example for this, because this is beyond stretching what can be considered usable language. Because unless somebody's trying to really mess with your head, or you're reading a really pretentious piece of text, you're not going to encounter more than 3 modal verbs within the same phrase. And even that is relatively rare. So now we've gotten through that horrible excursion, let's take a quick look at how this works in the other tenses. It's really not that hard, but I just want to give you a quick look at it so you don't forget that this doesn't only work in the present. In the preteritum, again, all we have to do is change the tense of our conjugated verb to the past tense. So that means in the sentence we've been using this entire time, we would get musste instead of muss. So the sentence would then be, der Apfel musste gegessen werden können. Or with one additional more modal verb, der Apfel musste gegessen werden wollen können. Everything else, see above. Starting with the perfect, we have to start combining rules again, because once again, our conjugated verb here will always be haben, a form of haben, and therefore the modal verb that would normally be conjugated gets instead pushed to the very end of the cluster, because still it is the outermost layer of meaning. Remember the stacked all. So now in the perfect, we would get der Apfel hat gegessen werden wollen können müssen. Or with a more likely scenario of 2 modal verbs, der Apfel hat gegessen werden können müssen. Der Apfel hat gegessen werden können müssen. Because again, more than 2 modal verbs back to back is highly unlikely, because it's just not, you can't consider that good style anymore. And then lastly, let's look at the Plusquamperfekt. Again, all we have to do is change the tense of haben. So now we use the past tense of haben instead of the present tense, like in the perfect. So in the Plusquamperfekt, we get der Apfel hatte gegessen werden können müssen. Or with 3 modal verbs, der Apfel hatte gegessen werden wollen können müssen. I'm going to leave the future tenses out because they're the least likely to be used with this, because they're also the 2 rarest tenses in general. But you can try forming them in the comments if you want, because all you really have to do is combine the rules for how to form the tenses, either in active or passive voice, and combining them with the rules I just taught you. So again, this is just another pattern that you're going to have to get the hang of it. Once you get it through your head, it's not that hard, I would reckon. And with that, I'm going to leave you for this extra. I hope I could unscramble the somewhat convoluted topic for you a bit. Bis dann!